Get peppy. Hello there. I am Chaz Licciardello, and this is Brendon O'Connor. Tell us about yourself, Brendon.
I'm an associate professor in the US Studies Centre and in the Department of Government at the University of Sydney. Last time I did this, I was in quarantine after visiting my girlfriend in Victoria.
Yes.
And so it's nice to be with you in the studio.
Thank you very much. The last time that we spoke, I asked you this, and you didn't give us much, but I'm going to try one more time. Do you have any gossip about Dr. David Smith that we should know? Because you work with him, you know the man well.
No comment.
One of these days. The Dr. Dave is feeling a bit sore today, and did you Dr. Brendon? Yes, Dr. Brendon. Dr. Brendon is very, very kindly stepping in. Thank you so much for this. I really do appreciate it because I don't know enough. So this is where you come in. Okay, a bit of housekeeping to begin. There's been a lot of people asking, well, not asking, but worrying about the stuff that I drink on this podcast. Because, I mean, you'd think I was drinking some hard liquor or something, but no, I'm just drinking soft drinks. Mm-hmm. But they're worried about the sheer volume of soft drinks I drink. So in response, I'm presenting with you today. I'm not going to tell you what it is because this is still, it's not really an ABC podcast. We can't even mention the ABC, I believe. But still, I'm respecting the principles of the ABC, and I am not going to tell you the brand, but it is a radioactive blue drink.
Mouthwash.
It tastes beautiful, though, I've got to say. But this is my response to people saying I should drink water. Some real housekeeping, though. A few people in the comments, I must admit, I didn't even hear this at the time. It just completely passed me by. But when Dr. Dave was telling us last week about the Belarus situation, he was talking about a previous landing of a plane with Bolivia, and it was all about Snowden. And he mentioned that Snowden leaked his secrets to WikiLeaks. That is, of course, not true. On the internet, they definitely pick up when you get something wrong about WikiLeaks. Snowden did not leak anything to WikiLeaks. He leaked things to Glenn Greenwald and friends, and I should have noticed that because Glenn Greenwald is one of my absolute favourites. So I should have picked that up, but I didn't. So that's not a correction. It's just a clarification. Also, I mentioned guns a few weeks ago, and I cited a study, but I didn't have the numbers. I've got the numbers now. What the study was, I was talking about the fact that there's been a huge increase in gun registrations in the last year, and I said I was vaguely aware that they were not the kinds of people you would expect to be getting guns. And what it found was the data from the Northeastern University and the Harvard Injury Control Research Center showed that a fifth of all the people who bought guns last year were first-time gun owners. And out of those new owners, half were women, a fifth were black, and a fifth were Hispanic. So there you go. There's some numbers. But one more thing with housekeeping. We're not going to talk about this. We're not going to have time. We've got so many things to talk about. But on our TV show, which is Planet America, which you can see, you might have just watched it. It's on ABC iView and on Facebook, on our Facebook page if you are interested. I mentioned something about open skies, which I want to mention on this podcast as well without going into too much detail, because I was all ready to wind up and just kick the Biden administration in the ass. Because are you across the Open Skies Treaty? It's a pretty minor thing, but I'm into arms control. It's essentially the Open Skies Treaty was something that was around until quite recently, where it's still around, but not with America anymore, where America, Russia, and NATO countries, essentially, they could charter this shitty plane, this sort of fantasy island style plane from the 70s that could take photos of anywhere at any time with almost no notice whatsoever across any of these countries. So that way, and the idea was not so much, aha, we've caught you out, so much as that people knew that at any point in time people could look. And so they were aware of that. So they didn't try and get away with things, right? And so it built confidence, and it made countries like America and Russia less tense about what the other ones might have in their defense capability. Very useful in the 90s when things were a little bit more paranoid. The Trump administration dropped out of that treaty last year. They said the Russians were violating it constantly, and so they dropped out. The Biden campaign like all Democrats, were very upset about that at the time. And we found out last week that Biden was not getting back into the treaty after he was so upset about it. And I was ready to go, hypocrite, and just to nail him with it. On the show, we spoke to someone. It was a pretty good interview. If you're interested, we'll have it online. Who is the ambassador, Clinton's ambassador to Russia and Ukraine, who said, it's a guy called Ambassador Pfeiffer. He said that he made a point I hadn't thought of, which is once you withdraw from a treaty to get back into it, you need 67 votes. You can't get 67 votes for anything in the Senate these days. So he said, really, there's just no point in them even trying.
Yeah.
And so I just thought I would just raise that because otherwise I was going to be very unfair.
Yeah.
So that's housekeeping. But Brendon, I'd like to kick off this week's stuff with you. You said you were going to bring a story about some journalism-style spying action from the Trump administration. I hadn't actually seen this story until you said that you told me about it. So would you like to tell us about it?
I think, crikey, we're going with it this morning on some list.
Yeah.
New York Times is reporting that the Trump administration, on a few occasions, used the Justice Department to look into the phone records, sometimes the email records of journalists who wrote things that they considered to be leaks.
Yep.
So the Trump White House was famously leaky.
Yeah, it's a lot of leaks.
Because everyone, had a version of how they stopped Donald Trump from doing something ridiculous, or how Donald Trump was their puppet, or how Donald Trump was their favorite, or they were Donald Trump's favorite. But the story was interesting in regard to a sense that national security elements had been breached, that conversations between the president and James Comey had been talked about by the New York Times where they shouldn't have been. So there was a case maybe to find out who the leaker was and not just celebrate them as a whistleblower as Trump normally did, but to, put them in jail or whatever the process was. And so it was really following up on some of the claims that Comey made when he resigned. And it seemed like an act of revenge as they were going after Comey to say, look, Comey had not only leaked to this law professor friend of his, but also to journalists. And therefore, Comey was the leaker in this case. And therefore, they could pin him down, call him a bad actor, and maybe have a court case against him.
And is there a suggestion that this monitoring was illegal?
Well, what is illegal about it is a sense that there was kind of no proper oversight, and Biden, in response, has said, "Look, I'm just not going to do this. This is politicizing the Justice Department in a really unhelpful way. This shouldn't occur." And Obama did it. Obama, over some of the national security issues, got into this a bit, I think, over the Bin Laden raids and other things. George W. Bush was quite keen on using these powers after the Patriot Act. But I think Biden rightly said, if America's going to put itself up there as a bastion of free information and a promoter of, some of the better values of liberal democracies, this sort of carry-on can't go on. So, I think a good position by Biden.
Yeah, I don't want to be cynical about this. Like, the cynic in me wants to sort of jump all over and go, oh, yeah, the last three presidents did it. He's going to do it. They always say they're not going to do it. Obama was Mr. Constitutional Law, and then he went and did it. But, look, Biden does make a big thing about norms, about trying to respect norms and trying to bring them back when they've gone away. So I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt until he disproves that benefit of the doubt. You can tell I don't have a huge amount of faith, but let's give him a chance. Because if he does respect that would be wonderful. Because honestly, the rise in uses of the Espionage Act over the last 20 years has been exponential. And we were getting to a position by Trump, we were getting to a position where it was becoming routine. How many times the Espionage Act was either being threatened or being used to potentially throw people in jail for doing journalism. So let's fingers crossed on that one, I'd say.
Yes, haul me back in and tell me I was naive.
How do you feel about the idea that even if this is a good thing, Biden shouldn't be directing the Department of Justice what to do? Well, because that's its own thing. interfering with the Department of Justice if you're the president.
Yeah. Well, I think the Department of Justice was directed under Donald Trump in this direction of revenge. So, there should be that separation. The Attorney General in all sorts of political systems was once considered a fairly independent position of the president. Janet Reno was pretty tough on Bill Clinton. She got some of the stuff going that got him in trouble over, with Kenneth Starr.
Yeah.
So that period in the 1990s where Reno did have that, there was some separation. Seems so far away from where we got to with Barr over the last couple of years. So, some sort of movement back towards a certain independence for the Attorney General and the Justice Department, I think would be great.
Let's talk a little bit more about Biden because I saw some interesting numbers the other day. This was looking at his disapproval numbers, which started high, like you would expect in today's negative polarization environment. He started off with disapproval numbers of 36%, which was the highest in history apart from Donald Trump, who started off with disapproval numbers of 45%, right? But at the 134-day mark, his disapproval has risen 4 points to 40%, which is still very high. Although, interestingly, now Clinton and Gerald Ford had higher disapproval ratings than Biden does now, even in an earlier period with less polarization. It's strange to say that there was less polarization when Bill Clinton was around, but there was. And yes, he's starting from a higher point, so there's less distance for him to go. But if you compare how much he's raised, his disapproval is raised in 134 days to previous presidents, there's some interesting numbers here. Biden gained by 4 points. Trump gained 12 points. This is in disapproval I'm talking about. Obama gained 20 points. W gained 19 points. Clinton gained 32 points. HW gained 7, Reagan 8, Carter 11, Ford 40, Nixon 9, Lyndon Johnson 10, John Kennedy 5. You got to go back to Eisenhower for a similar rise, going up to 4. Now, he started from a much higher point, obviously. But when you're comparing to numbers like 32, 40, 20, so forth, there is something about Biden which is weird, which I can't quite put my finger on, but there is something about him which is different to most politicians at the moment, whatever it may be. Maybe it's as simple as white, non-threatening man. I don't know, but whatever it is, you got a theory?
Yeah, I've got a few thoughts. Ford pardons Nixon, doesn't he? So the 40%.
That explains it.
Clinton and to some extent Obama don't get off to great starts. Clinton has all these sort of continuous minor scandals from the beginning. Bringing some of the Arkansas crew with him, all Troopergate, these state troopers who don't get jobs and then tell stories about their achy breaky heart.
Back in '92, sure.
And so there's a lot of things that go wrong for Bill Clinton pretty early on and show that maybe he's not as prime for the job as he thinks he is. So with Biden, I think there is the sense that he's just doing what he thinks is necessary. And I think that testing of the waters that you saw with Obama, which sometimes I think in comparison now looked quite timid in comparison to Biden, that Biden has in some ways seized the moment of crisis and taken it as an opportunity. And therefore, at least he's doing things. You could dislike what he's doing, but you can't say, look, this guy's, not ready for the job, or he's not he's stumbling around trying to work out what he wants to do.
You use the phrase testing of the waters. Now, could it be a situation where when Barack Obama was testing the water, the pool was quite still, but when Biden came in to test the water, Trump had just splashed around like buggery, just done a big bomb right in the middle of the pool. So the water was already flopping. It was a lot easier to test it.
Yeah, and part of
the torture analogy.
The financial crisis had been partly sort of calmed by Democrats kind of getting on side with Hank Paulson, the Treasury Secretary, and saying, okay, we're going to right the banks, we're going to stabilize things. So in some ways, some of the disaster had been sort of been reduced by the TARP and other things early on in Obama's administration. So he couldn't come in, and it didn't seem his inclination to come in and say, look, it's an absolute mess I've inherited economically. The Republican approach to this is appalling, and I'm going to go in a different direction. He was, that second book of his, The Audacity of Hope, was sort of the polar opposite to Dreams of My Father, in that it was a dull, boring book about bipartisanship largely.
Yeah.
And he tried to stick to that, unfortunately.
Another interesting element about Biden is I read an article, I think it was in The Atlantic, this week, where they were talking about the fact that there's no attack books about him being written. The conservative bookshops, they're not churning out Biden books. They churned out books about all the previous Democratic presidents. At the moment, they're churning out books about cancelling, cancel culture, and about critical race theory, but not about Biden. And there was a quote here which I thought was quite amusing from Eric Nelson, who is the executive editor at Broadside Books, the conservative imprint of HarperCollins. This was his quote: "Nobody who watches Fox thinks that Joe Biden is in charge of the country. The popular narrative on the right is that Biden is a kind of figurehead whose White House is actually run by radical leftists behind the scenes. If somebody came to me and was like, I have a book on Biden's secret plan to destroy America, I would ask, how many times does the word nap appear in the index?"
I was rather taken by those Clinton sort of, evisceration books. There was an article in today's Sydney Morning Herald by Ambrose Evans Pritchard. Now that's quite the name, isn't it? To get out. And he wrote one of them. There were numerous written by sort of other people on the right. David Brooke, who's now switched over, wrote some of this stuff. So there was an enormous library to get yourself across on the claims that Bill Clinton had been involved in all sorts of things, from running arms to Nicaragua to drug running and all sorts of stuff. So that there was a minor industry more on the internet with Obama. But you're right that Biden, in some ways, his age, this affability, his known quantity has led to less of the sense of there's this kind of attack line about how much he's a liar, a sleaze, a phony, or whatever the line is. I
want to give you an example as well to illustrate what I'm talking about, and then contrast it with Kamala Harris, who definitely does not have the same Teflon quality that Biden has. This was a quote from Biden this week.
The data shows young black entrepreneurs are just as capable of succeeding given the chance as white entrepreneurs are. But they don't have lawyers, they don't have accountants, but they have great ideas.
Black entrepreneurs don't have accountants and lawyers, apparently. Now, that's quite a condescending thing to say. I would suggest probably inaccurate. But I'll just keep on building the case, and then I'll ask you your thoughts. On the same week as he said that quote there, which it might have just disappeared. I mean, it did disappear. But the same week he said that, Biden had a meeting with the Congressional Black Caucus, and this is what happened. As a candidate, he said that he supported a commission on reparations. Okay, we're talking about reparations for slavery here. All right. Obviously, it's a complicated issue, a delicate issue, but we're talking about a commission here, not actual reparations, just a commission to examine the topic of reparations, right? On Tuesday, he met members of the Congressional Black Caucus, and they brought up the reparations bill. What's he going to do with that? And this is a quote from Brenda Lawrence, the second vice chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. He didn't disagree with what we were doing. He did talk about his plate being full with trying to get the infrastructure bill passed, and he really wanted to make sure that he could get that through before he took on anything else. Now, that is a real fob off, as if you can't try to have at the same time a commission, which is going to go away for 18 months. You won't see it again for ages, to examine reparations while you're doing the infrastructure bill. He basically told them to bugger off because it's a politically sensitive issue. They took it the same week as that quote came out. And he just got away. It just disappeared without a trace. No one cared. We just moved on. And I contrast that with Kamala Harris, who this very same week simply tweeted out the phrase, "enjoy the long weekend" on Friday with a picture of her smiling. And she just copped thousands upon thousands of abusive tweets where people were suggesting she was treading on their dead relatives' graves because of her disrespect for Memorial Day, because she didn't mention the the veterans when she said, enjoy your long weekend. This is on Friday, she tweeted that. Then on the Sunday and the Monday, when it's actually Memorial Day, she tweeted all the usual pieties about veterans and respecting the troops. But she copped it in the neck for enjoy your long weekend. And Biden was just goofing it up, screwing up the reparations bill and having that little gaffe, and just nothing happens to him. What do you reckon?
Well, you're right. You know, there is, of course, kind of a racial dimension, a gendered dimension to how hate seems to spread itself across the media, certainly across the internet. You know, there's a great sort of satirical novel that came out a couple of years ago called I Hate the Internet, which is, you know, starts with a series of kind of abusive tweets and all directed at female comedians. You know, this is, we know this is one of the sort of unfortunate poisons of the world we deal in, and it is Biden's, you know, it is to Biden's advantage. His age, his whiteness, his Scranton roots, his, you know, his hard luck stories, his personal tragedies, which people are familiar with regarding his wife and his son. So I think he gets the pass in the same way that I suppose certain American kind of sitcoms of a certain era, you know, are just seen as, well, you know, they're inoffensive, even though they're, you know, don't have any black characters, and everyone's of a particular sort of, you know, sexuality or whatever it might be. So I think he's able to ride that. But I mean, do you occasionally have the sense, though, that he is the sort of last of a certain generation, that there will be a more, well, on the Democrat side, inevitably, a much more multicultural face to its politics, and Biden represents a sort of, you know, a transit of the Second World War generation that we're not going to see a, you know, an 80-year-old version of next time round, are we?
No. I think you're probably right. I also feel a little bit like my torturous pool analogy before. I do feel that Biden lucked out in two ways. Number one, that the fact he's so boring, but also so ordinary and so harmless. Like, he just seems harmless, even if in reality he's not. He just seems harmless. But on top of that, I feel like the foibles that Biden has, Trump shares a lot of those foibles. And Trump was the same thing turned up to 11, so to speak. And then he had his other problems as well. But yeah, Biden's vanity and Biden's gaffes and Biden's sort of insensitivity at times and stuff like that. Like, they're all things that Trump had much, much, much more of. And so now it just seems kind of lame when Biden does that kind of stuff. And I think he might not, if he'd been in the same position 10 years away from Trump rather than directly after Trump, I don't think people would have been quite as generous. Yeah. Anyway. But let's talk more about what Biden's actually doing rather than this kind of stuff. One of your specialties is environmental policy, and I wanted to ask you about the Arctic Reserve because this week Biden suspended oil and gas leases in the Arctic National Wildlife Reserve. So do you want to talk to us about that?
Yeah, I mean, I teach a few lectures on American environmental policy, which usually leaves me entirely depressed until recently, and a sense of
or lack thereof. Yeah, that's right.
But teaching them to 18-year-olds or 19-year-olds, I'm usually, well, you guys have got to suffer more of this than I have. I'm sorry to tell you. The sense of Biden had made this campaign promise that in the sort of Arctic wilderness of the United States in Alaska, that there wouldn't be drilling. I mean, obviously a pristine environment, beautiful pictures of polar bears on all the articles about this topic, and an area, that has been protected in the past. And Trump went into that area with a lot of support from all sorts of politicians, the Republican senators of Florida, and also the, Murkowski out today, the governor of Florida, very strongly supportive of this.
Alaska.
So, yeah, Alaska.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so in Alaska, rather.
Yeah.
So the, the pushback against Biden has been, well, there has been a continuation of oil drilling in Wyoming. There's other places in Alaska where oil drilling is occurring. He hasn't, he's not totally against using national parks for oil drilling, but this is the kind of headline act. So in some regards, is it is it a case of kind of symbolism that there's a symbolic sort of weight of this area of drilling, where drilling in general, I suppose, new oil sort of drilling is a move to continue fossil fuels rather than renewable energies? Is this the direction the United States needs to, in fact, turn against, not just in this one instance, in this pristine place, because of concerns about damage? Is it something that in general the federal government shouldn't be approving this drilling in national parks, new oil oil drilling, and turning to more alternative energies? And I suppose that brings you to this kind of point of, with Kerry, with Biden, is there the sense that gradualism, that hopes on technology fronts, that using the market to improve the environment is going to work, or that you do need a new paradigm? You need a paradigm which says, okay, this kind of growth-based approach to the economy has got to be rethought, that it can't just be about if it creates jobs, it's a good thing, that you might need to have some sacrifice along the way. And that's, I think, where, the Biden policy probably hasn't gone, and that's where its critics are in the environmental movement, saying it's too much dependent on the market, on businesses doing the right thing, and it's not fundamentally just saying this requires sacrifice, this requires a kind of national effort in the nature of a war effort, that the problem is so dramatic. And there was a friend of mine had a book out recently on climate change and the nation state, Anatol Lievin, a scholar who's just gone to the Quincy Institute, which is a fun place to watch podcasts and all sorts of things from. And Anatol's argument
What's the book called?
It's called Climate Change and the Nation State.
Would you recommend it?
Highly recommend it.
Yeah,
and it's an
I'll
argument.
put it on the book list.
Argument for using nationalism. So in the last 4 years, many of us have thought of nationalism as like the demon in the cellar. The nationalism is the thing that causes politics to be, simplistic, xenophobic. He's saying, no, nationalism has another side. Civic nationalism, if you can harness it, you can get people to make sacrifice for the New Deal generation or the Second World War generation. And that's what's required, a harnessing of a sort of national pride in the future, in the whole country of the United States, and using nationalism for the good. And by doing that, you bring the military involved. You say, look, this is a national security issue, get the military involved. And Anatol's argument is that that's the only way you bring Republicans with you. That's the one institution they still respect. So you securitize the problem, as you did with terrorism, probably very unfortunately. You bring Republicans along by getting the military to talk about the issue as a national security threat, as a threat to the nation, rather than seeing it as an issue that's going to be solved by international organizations, because although I think agreements are required, the nation state has to make the changes. That's the instrument of change here.
It's interesting what you say about the military is the one area where the Republicans can get on board, because in the last few weeks we're starting to see the beginnings of the fraying of that, where Republicans are saying the military's gone woke, and you got Crenshaw and there's a Cotton have got this weird kind of dobbing a woke military guy hotline now for the military. Like, they're actually starting to turn against, I suppose, the commanders of the military rather than the grunts.
We had a bit of that here in Australia as well, didn't we?
Yes, we did. We're always leading away from America. Let me ask you a few questions on this topic. First of all, with ANWR, is this one of those areas where there is such a large reservoir of oil and gas in the area that it just destroys any hope of hitting targets if they start drilling there? Or is it not like that? It's just a symbolism thing.
Well, people are throwing around big numbers. And so people are throwing around, I think, $11 billion worth of oil reserves or something, probably the governor of Alaska. Yeah. So,
sure.
So I think, it's as I was saying before, it's a bigger question of, are you going to use this as a turn against fossil fuels? Not just see it as a kind of a safety issue, of a pristine nature issue, that you use it on two fronts to say, look, it's dangerous to you don't have Arctic sort of areas that commonly, and but it's also sort of, we're going in a different direction with energy policy, and that I think is the big challenge for Biden, whether he's got the courage to do that.
My second question on this is that the usual situation with these kinds of decisions is they'll look at $3 gas, which is expensive in America. By the way, $3 gas is per gallon. In Australia, that's 80 cents a litre. Let's not forget that. But anyway, that's, oh my God, gas is so expensive, $3 a gallon gas. It's because they're not drilling in the Arctic. Now, am I right in saying that if they drilled in the Arctic, it'll take about 15 years or whatever for that to actually see any effect on the pump whatsoever, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, one of my favourite sort of terms when you study oil, and occasionally I teach classes on it, is, it's a fungible product.
Yes.
It goes into a world market. The barrel price is, one of those things that those of us who get excited about political economy kind of follow, and, recessions often do follow the barrel price. But it's a global market. The Americans have added to that market. They've created a degree of energy independence, but that's, as you say, it takes a considerable time to come online. I mean, their fracking, their use of shale oil was a game changer in some regards because of the price of Middle Eastern oil going up. They were able to, get into new ways of finding oil.
All right, the next question, I've got a few of them for you, is the Alaska governor has said, and I always like legal arguments. Dr. Dave will testify to that. He doesn't like them as much as I do. But let me throw one at you. The Alaska governor says, quote, the Biden administration's suspension of leases in the ANWR 1002 area is contrary to federal law. Section 20001 of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act clearly says the Secretary shall establish and administer a competitive oil and gas program for the leasing, development, production and transportation of oil and gas in and from the coastal plain. Shall. Neither the President nor the Secretary are given the discretion to decide otherwise. Do you have a view on that?
I did do a bit of reading today on this.
Yeah.
I'm not completely gotcha on it, but the sense is he's arguing that all of the environmental, audits, checking of the safety of this drilling are the best of any, situation in the United States, maybe in the entire universe. But I think there's still a discretion that the federal government has as federal lands. And so, this will be something that's played out to get him re-elected as a states' right issue. But I think there is, probably still some ability for the feds to come back in and overturn what Trump allowed this drilling to occur after Obama. Yeah.
Well, next question is a slightly different one, which is that the ANWR is an issue that keeps coming up. It's as you say, it's a favourite probably because of polar bears. But in terms of actual climate change concern, there is a much bigger issue that doesn't get mentioned nearly as much, which is the Permian Basin down in Texas and in New Mexico. Now, the federal government owns basically the whole land in New Mexico, so they have the control over what happens there. In the Texas side, which is most of the Permian Basin, is private land, essentially. Now, there is definitely, I'm sure, enough gas in the Permian Basin to just blow any target that anyone has in the world just by itself. There's a massive amount of gas there. And until Texas goes blue, if it ever goes blue, there is zero chance of the Republican governor there regulating the usage of that basin. So is America just screwed when it comes to this kind of stuff until they deal with the Permian Basin?
Well, I suppose that's why you turn it into a national security issue, don't you? Yes. This is a crisis. This requires, the federal government to step in all sorts of areas that it hasn't stepped in. Now, is that a kind of creeping authoritarianism? People who look into the sort of the dark future of climate change say, will there in 20 years' time be tough Republicans who come along and say climate change requires all of this tough action and authoritarian action, and the Democrats, like they were on communism and terrorism, were weak, soft, inactive, and you need a Republican who'll be a true believer in doing something for climate change. For many of us, that seems inconceivable. But if we think of the history of kind of the ways that toughness has been used to militarize certain issues, it's not right-wing sort of authoritarianism on climate issues isn't inconceivable, just as sort of, left or center-left authoritarianism isn't inconceivable.
Well, environmentalism goes hand in hand with right-wing authoritarianism in Europe. So there's no reason why it couldn't in America. theoretically.
Yeah. I mean,
Theoretically.
So I don't know what can of worms I'm opening up, suggesting that you should militarize it and turn it into something the Defense Department is interested in. But I think, or involved in. But I think it is, the nature of the crisis. If you take the science seriously, and I think few politicians have until very recently, that you need dramatic actions, and how you deal with state laws, personal property, the oil industry. Those are all big questions ahead.
Do you have any thoughts about how Biden has approached climate change so far? I mean, obviously he's limited in what he can do without Congress, and nothing's going to happen there anytime soon. How do you feel he's been dealing with? Like, do you feel like, for instance, his targets are either A, realistic, or B, enough? And what about everything else? Yeah,
well, off the top of the head, he obviously first thing was to endorse the Paris targets of zero emissions by 2050. That was the minimum you'd do as a Democrat president, but he did it, of course. He said by 2030 that the emissions in the United States would be reduced by 50% of their current rate. That would require, I think, a lot of cooperation with business, as I was saying before. And there would be, I think, a sort of what some people have called a kind of accountability gap. Like, how's that going to be monitored without a cap and trade bill in the US Congress, as you say, which is a bit of a non-starter, unfortunately, at the moment. So I think, the amount of money he's put in, could be a bit bolder. It's certainly not, you're not going to call it the Green New Deal light or even anywhere near it. I
do notice that he's negotiated away almost all his environmental element of the infrastructure bill.
Yeah.
If not all of it. I think it's pretty close to all of it.
Yeah, reading the Green New Deal the other day for a class, what is really striking about that proposal put forward by, Ocasio-Cortez is that there's, so much of it is about really jobs. So much of it was really a sort of red-green New Deal. It was a social democratic platform to say let's deal with poverty and inequality in the United States, and how do we get a huge number of the population who is underemployed or working poor involved in better paying work, and get them involved in sort of a huge infrastructure program. So, there was a model there. And as you say, I don't think that's the model he's been bold enough to take on board for a range of reasons. But it was an extraordinary proposal. And, Sanders obviously ran on a lot of that proposal. When you looked at the numbers, they were impressive. I was incredibly impressed by them and sort of taken by them as great ideas. But that was an enormous amount of money. Yeah. And his retort to that, if you remember the campaign of what we back a year ago or so a little earlier, it wasn't meeting him halfway.
No, that's not Sanders' style.
Yeah.
Do you have anything else to say about this topic before we move on?
Well, obviously crucial in terms of negotiations globally. So what is there going to be? A climate summit where I think our own Prime Minister will be at. The Kerry has been sort of marshalling people around the world to go into it. Is it going to occur in the UK or something over the next few months? So there's a 2021, global climate summit that the US has been kind of trying to marshal the forces. So inevitably, I think you do need action domestically. The state has to do the states of the governments of various countries have to make the decisions and tax and change their climate policies. But also you need international agreements as well. I don't think certainly can't just have international agreements, but you certainly need both.
Yeah, you're not doing it without China and India at the very least.
For sure.
Okay, let's. I can't believe I'm saying this, but let's move on to 2022/2024 because there is actually some news in that arena already. Nevada are proposing a law. Well, they've actually passed. The legislature has passed a bill. Hasn't gone to the governor yet. The governor is laying low at this point in time. He's a Democrat. Legislature's passed a bill to make Nevada the first primary in 2024. The Republicans want nothing to do with that. The Democrats are debating it at the moment, so we're not sure. Now, just to be clear, if the governor passes that, there'll then be 3 states that can currently have laws that say they're the first in 2024, which is New Hampshire, Iowa, and Nevada. Now, Iowa and Nevada have gotten away with it by one being a primary and one being a caucus. Nevada wants to be a primary. They used to be a caucus, and they want to go primary. So they're going head-to-head with New Hampshire now. They argue that demographically they're much more representative, as if that makes any difference to the first in the first primary. Like, it's not like there's any reason the first primary has to be representative. I mean, during the last primary, we heard a lot of arguments of people saying, well, why should we get all these white middle-class people to select the nominee when the Democrats have all these different demographics? But they didn't select the nominee, did they? Biden came about 17th in both New Hampshire and Iowa, and then ended up doing it in a canter. So it's not that the first one necessarily has all the say. I don't know really what influence they actually have in the end. I'm not sure. That's not me minimizing it. I'm saying I actually don't know. But regardless of what it is, it may be coming out. What happens here is presumably the Democrats have to make up their mind. New Hampshire won't listen to them if they put Nevada first, and New Hampshire will just bump themselves up, which Democrats can't stop them doing, but they can then take away their delegates, which will take care of them pretty fast. Like, this has happened before. This has happened a lot of times before, where someone tries to go ahead and they lose.
Florida.
Yeah, and Michigan has happened as well. So what are your thoughts on all this?
Well, I think the early caucuses and primaries are important for the lower ranked candidates. So what we have last time, obviously, is the favourite or the most well-known candidate with the most money and some regards and the sort of name recognition of being a vice president, doing really amazingly poorly, as you say, particularly in New Hampshire, the first primary, but able to bounce back as those other candidates coalesce around him and pull out. I think if you're a minor candidate and you don't have quite that sort of name recognition, they can be devastating blows, as it was for Howard Dean when he was running in 2004. An performance for a relatively unknown is bad. A good performance for Barack Obama in 2008, who was, not the favourite, of course. Hillary Clinton was that year. So I think last time round was a very unusual situation where you've got someone who's hot favourite for a while, then bombs in the early primaries, but then the party basically says we're not going to have Sanders, and Klobuchar pulls out and Buttigieg pulls out, and they put the weight behind him, and Warren makes it difficult for Sanders. So I think that model. Nevada, to use a lame pun, is making a sort of gamble here to get a bit of attention, and it's not going to work. I mean, sure, they've got a more kind of representative population, but the tradition of New Hampshire going first isn't going to be overridden by, as you say, the party. So they can either go first and not be counted, or they can go third and be taken pretty seriously. Okay,
so the prediction's in. An interesting article I saw from Harry Enton, which I might put in here. I'll put the actual article in the homework if you want to have a look. Look in the blurb of either the YouTube or the Facebook. Okay, it's about Hispanics, and we saw during 2020 Biden not do so well amongst Hispanics, especially Hispanic men. And there was some thought about maybe there's a bit of emotion on. There was speculation about whether it was linked to defund the police or linked to woke type stuff or socialism or whatever. That the Democrats might be on the way to losing some Hispanic men. Harry Enton had this really interesting observation that Biden's approval rating with Hispanics currently stands at 72%. Compared to his overall approval rating of about 55%. So that's a 17-point advantage, right, amongst Hispanics. He won 65% of Hispanics, according to the exit polls in 2020. And according to Democratic firm Catalyst, he won 61% of Hispanics. So he's now got a much higher approval rating than he did in 2020 amongst Hispanics. But even controlling for the higher approval rating he has generally, if you look, he was 17 points better than the general populace in 2020. amongst Hispanics. So no, right now he's 17 points better with Hispanics than he is generally. That's 72% to 55%. In 2020, he was 10 to 14 points better off with Hispanics than he was generally. And if you allocate undecideds, because in polls at the moment is undecideds, then it's even more so. He's about 20 points higher now than he was in 2020. Then in 2020, he was 10 to 14 points higher. But that's interesting. But Harry Enton's observation is much more interesting, which is this is not a unique phenomenon. The last 5 incumbents since George H.W. Bush did better with Hispanics after they were elected than when they were elected. Both Republicans and Democrats. And there may be something about Hispanics liking incumbents.
Yeah.
I don't know why, but
I think you could make that argument more generally about men, couldn't you? That maybe there's something about men supporting men in office, that the sense of supporting the president, Hispanic men wanting to stick with the incumbent, or at least being more sympathetic to the incumbent than women, that is a trend I think you see in a number of different polls and maybe in different countries as well. Generally higher male support for the incumbent and from conservative incumbents than female support. And amongst the Hispanic community, there was a little bit of a similar trend with African American men. I mean, it wasn't huge, but it was a trend that there were African American men drawn to Trump, certainly much more than there were African American women.
Yes,
that was his, he was at his nadir with that group.
Yes.
No support, and that in both 2016, if you look at Florida, those Hispanic and black men that supported Trump was probably pretty significant to his victory, in the exit polling data, which is not terrific. And some of the post-election analysis, particularly from Harvard, I've looked at on 2016, there's just there's an uptake in Hispanic men and black men supporting him compared to what Romney got when he ran against Obama in 2012. And it's just, it's moving the dial. It's such a close state that it's part of the story. The bigger part of the story is a lot of whites without college degrees just come out in huge numbers, and they really move the dial towards Trump, and and particularly in the Midwest. But in Florida, you can see it, that there's a bit of a swing, not huge, but when small margins matter, amongst Hispanic men and African American men towards Trump. There was some appeal there, and there might be just appeal in the last election as an incumbent.
Yeah, well, it's something for us to watch. As far as 2022 goes, there's some interesting. I mean, everyone's expecting it to be pretty tough for the Democrats in the House. They've only got like 4 seats or 5 seats to defend, essentially. Just redistricting alone will eat them up. Larry Sabato, the prince of this kind of stuff, has put out his first district assessment already.
Crystal balling.
Yeah, that's right. He reckons there's 19 toss-up seats for Democrats, and there's 2 toss-up seats for Republicans. So, as in Democrats are defending 19 toss-ups and Republicans are defending 2 toss-ups. So, if they split them evenly, then the Democrats would get pantsed, and they will comfortably lose. And that's if they split them evenly. If it is a Republican-friendly climate, then that's some devastation right there, just from the toss-ups alone, leaving aside the leanings and all the rest. But anyway, just flag that. We've also seen this week some indicators of how the different sides might want to fight this election. Newt Gingrich is apparently working on a new contract with America. For those who are younger than me, back in 1994. That was Newt Gingrich had the original contract with America then, which was like their marketing campaign where they had a certain number of points, 12 points or something of what they were going to do. And and they're trying to build the 994 vibes now because it was a big sort of swing.
Based on the 10 Commandments.
It was
It was in TV. It was in TV Week. That was when, pre-internet days. It was one of the biggest publications in America, your TV Guide, and they printed the contract within TV Week. I wrote a chapter of a book on this, and it was a winning strategy. It was a turnaround from the 1950s. The Republicans had been in opposition since Eisenhower, and they get control of the Congress in 94. And Gingrich modelled his first 100 days, not just on FDR, but he talked about modelling them on Napoleon as well. Napoleon's first day. So the hubris of the man knows few limits, and it's it's amazing that he's back after all he's been through with Trump and his current wife being ambassador to the Vatican, which is one of those amazing turns of events.
Yes. Well, it was. He's got an interesting quote here, Gingrich. He says, "It should be positive. School choice. Teaching American history for real, abolishing the 1619 Project, eliminating critical race theory, and what the Texas legislature is doing. We should say, bring it on." Now, the Texas legislature is basically banning lots of culture war stuff. So 4 of those 5 positive things are actually banning things, we should say. But the interesting thing as well is, I'm not sure you recall this, but back in 2016, Trump already had the contract with the American voter, so he's actually already pulled this lever. But they may be trying to pull it again. We'll see. I don't know if this stuff works anymore. The news cycle's probably a bit bigger than this now, I reckon.
Yeah, I suppose making America great again was a Reagan line, wasn't it? That was recycled. So it's as a marketing tool, you can flog the dead horse on these things.
An alternative is it might be a crime election. Certainly Republicans have been talking a lot about the increase in homicides last year. There was a gigantic increase in homicides last year. Still pales in comparison to what it was in the 90s and 2000, but they basically turned the clock back 6 or 7 years in terms of homicide reductions, been reversed last year. It went up, and it's still actually going up even now. Whether it's a blip or not, we'll find out. But they certainly see an opportunity, and it's interesting because I'll just give you a background very briefly. There's something called the Breathe Act, which Presley and Tlaib are pushing in Congress at the moment. And it's a slightly more hardcore version of the criminal justice reforms that we've heard about so far. Like they're basically disbanding the DEA, that's the Drug Enforcement Agency, disbanding ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, defunding police partly, not wholly, and then investing in a lot of social programs, eliminating mandatory minimum sentences, giving prisoners the right to vote, establishing baby bonds, a whole bunch of stuff. Anyway, it's criminal justice reform, but just pretty big. Now, they had a New Mexico special election to replace Deb Haaland, who's the Interior Secretary at the moment. That was this week. And the Democrat running in that is this woman called Stansbury, who supports the Breathe Act. Mm-hmm. And the Republican decided to... Now, Deb Haaland won this seat by like 29 points. Okay, it's a very Democrat seat. But they obviously were just trying to try out the crime tactic and see, not if he would win the seat, but if they could shave a bit off the margin. Oh, beer. That's all right. Do you need to get it? Is that okay?
No.
Okay, all right.
Thought I had it off.
That's right. So they wanted to see if they could shave the margin a bit by running a fairly ugly anti-crime campaign. And when I say fairly ugly, I mean fairly ugly.
We need to pass the Breathe Act in Congress.
Melanie Stansbury supports the most dangerous legislation in America as Albuquerque faces record numbers of homicides. Legislation that defunds and dismantles the police, empties every federal prison in 10 years. Murderers, rapists, and child molesters walking free.
We need to pass the Breathe Act in Congress.
Stop the madness. Stop Melanie Stansbury before it's too late.
I'm Mark Moores, and I approve this message.
So you get the idea. So child molesters are walking free while we're hearing little girls scream, and that's up there.
Yeah, it's Willie Horton all over again, isn't it?
I think
1988. Yeah,
I think Willie Horton's subtle compared to that one.
Yeah,
we should say it didn't work. Haaland got 59% of the vote in 2018. In 2020, she got 58% of the vote, and Stansbury got 60% of the vote. So it made no difference. But is that what we have to look forward to, do you think, in 2022?
it wouldn't be surprising, would it? I mean, it would be kind of within a playbook that we've, come to expect in some regards of the Republicans, using fear as a clear tactic. I don't know if later on we're going to talk about the return of Donald Trump,
We are.
and I might say my thoughts in that regard. Do you want me to continue on that line now?
No, we're coming to it pretty soon. That's okay. Okay, well, I'll move on to Congress then, and then we'll move on to those kinds of issues. I should just to update you guys on where we're at with the infrastructure bill. They may have a deal by the time you listen to this. They're getting closer, that's for sure. Let's put it this way: if Mitch McConnell wants a deal, they've got a deal. I think there's a question of he says he wants a deal. Does he actually want a deal? I don't know. We'll find out because they're getting real close. Basically, the Republicans started about 500 billion. They worked their way up to 928 million over 8 years, not 5 years. Only $257 million of that was new spending. The rest was from COVID spending. And it was only on infrastructure-y things, like really infrastructure-y things. Biden started at 2.3 trillion, worked his way down to 1.7 trillion.
Yep.
Then, and his spending was funded by a corporate tax hike. Republicans said no corporate tax hike. And so Biden today called their bluff. Said, okay, $1 trillion worth of spending. That's what you've got. $1 trillion worth of spending. I'll see you there. Yeah. As far as infrastructure-y things go, sure, let's just do infrastructure-y things. He stabbed the environment in the back when he did that. But he said, okay, no, I'm calling you. Okay, we'll give you what you want there. No corporate tax hike. We're going to pay for it it'll be new spending. It'll be all new spending, but we're going to pay for it with a 15% minimum corporate tax. So we're not hiking the corporate tax. We're just making sure that you pay some corporate tax. We're going to have a floor rather than a higher ceiling. I don't know. Maybe he's not senile after all. It's a clever negotiating strategy as far as calling their bluff goes. Now there'll be some Democrats who aren't happy with what he's given up by any stretch of the imagination. But in terms of calling their bluff, I don't think he could do it much better. I should just explain that 15% corporate tax minimum. That was part of. I lose track. There's so many bills flying around. I think it was his original infrastructure bill. They were talking about having a global minimum tax of 21%. But then they started talking to other countries, and other countries saying no. And so now they've chiseled it down to 15% for a global minimum. And so now they're instituting it in this deal here. The only countries that have said yes to it so far are Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the United Kingdom, which is not going to be enough. There are more countries out there than that last time I looked. And obviously, as soon as one country breaks, then every corporation will just register in Bahamas or whatever. Anyway, what do you think about this negotiating?
Well, I think the idea of having a floor on corporate taxes to begin with is a great argument. Romney ran on that in 2012. That was how he was going to sort the budget issues out in the debt clock and all of the rest of it. I suppose I've been a skeptic of Biden's idea that a bipartisan sort of negotiations can occur. That seemed to me to be, something you have to say, but whether you have to do it was another matter. But with the possibility of filibusters, with the Joe Manchin situation in West Virginia, so it is complex. And what else can he do but negotiate? He can't. He doesn't have that majority that Obama had into early 2009 when he could push things through and get his way much more. So his wiliness, I think, does come to the fore. There is I think some credit to give to him.
I'd have to say, at the very least, even if he's just following a Manchin strategy here of just making Joe Manchin happy, he could not have come up with a suggestion here that would make Joe Manchin happier, because Joe Manchin didn't like the corporate tax hike either. So Joe Manchin would have to be very happy with this compromise. And if they say no, then surely this would be enough to get Joe Manchin to go to reconciliation. I would have thought. Like he's given a lot up here, a lot. So it's and it's interesting, although having said that, maybe Joe Manchin doesn't want to maybe it doesn't matter because they've got this new reconciliation ruling, which is very, very technical. But the parliamentarian, Elizabeth McDonough, this week came back with a ruling where she said, remember how I said that you could adjust You could revise any of your previous reconciliation bills to get around the filibuster by just revising it over and over again, so you'd have unlimited bites at reconciliation. I didn't mean that. What you need to do is, first of all, you need to go through this very lengthy process, which is going to take you a long time every time you want to revise, and I'm not going to let you do it unless you have a good reason. Getting around the filibuster is not a good reason. It needs to be a whole new recession, or it needs to be a whole new reason which you couldn't possibly foresee before, why you need to go back to. So in other words, they're back essentially to probably only having 3 hits at reconciliation. So the question is, do they want to use one of them on this? Like they've got still a year and 3 months to go, and they've got 2 more hits. So yeah, we'll see about that. So yeah, maybe they want a deal for that. Interesting little side. I've been enjoying seeing the Biden administration try to redefine bipartisanship. Because normally bipartisanship, you associate that with having Republicans and Democrats, right? They're saying no. Bipartisanship is when there's Republican and Democrat support in the community, in polls. Yeah. Right? It's going, well, hang on. There's always someone who supports everything from any group. There's always 6% or whatever. So where's your line there? But anyway, Morning Consult asked voters how they felt about this. 10% of voters agree with Biden's definition of bipartisanship means people, the community and lawmakers. Or actually only voters, that's their position. 32% says it pertains to only lawmakers. 43% says both voters and lawmakers. And that's the same for right across the board. Democrats, Republicans, Independents, all basically are in the same position there. So anyway, I don't think that's working, but it's a good try. And a few updates, and then I want to hear what you have to say about the guaranteed income thing. We'll get to that very quickly. Rescue plan update. The SBA, the Small Business Association requirement that only applications for restaurant relief. There was a requirement that the first to try and improve equity, to help minorities. The people going for restaurant relief, they would only take applications from women and from racial minorities to begin with. They went to court. They lost. And when I say they, I mean the government lost. So it's like $28.6 billion fund. And the theory from the court was that isn't enough money. They're not saying you have to give more money, but they're saying if you have a fund which is only $28 billion and women and black people can go first, no one else is going to get a go. It's going to run out. And they said that you could get away with it there's exceptions for racial preferences when they're enacted to remedy past societal discrimination. But to do that, you need to be able to point to a specific episode of past discrimination and demonstrate that discrimination was both intentional and perpetrated by the government to be rectified by the government, and they could not do that. So anyway, now they're not allowed to do that. That's just a bit of an update there. For the people update, that's the voting rights bill. Biden's placed Harris in charge of getting the votes for the voting rights bill, which is a bit of a hospital pass because they're not going to get that up. Harris said that she eats no for breakfast. That's what she said. I suspect she's about to have a feast over in the Senate because the Senate's like the Sizzler all-you-can-eat of no's. It's like a buffet over there. Anyway, we'll see how that goes. And another just general legislation update. Actually, let's leave that. I'll do that another time. I want to hear what you have to say when we talk about the rescue plan updates about the guaranteed income experiments with the child tax rebates.
Yes, I mean, that has been something that people who have been excited about guaranteed minimum incomes have been talking about in the United States since, the 1970s. There was a floated plan during the Nixon administration. Pat Moynihan was very involved in it. Obviously, there was a lot of talk with Andrew Yang and others about guaranteed income during the last campaign. And Biden and his people were able to slip in those rescue plans $300 a month per child for families into the bill, which was, it was a guaranteed income plan in the United States, where when I read it, the journalist who does a really great job of covering this is Jason DeParel, who's written a long time on poverty for the New York Times and a number of books. my jaw dropped to some extent because this is not the kind of thing you're used to seeing in the United States.
Zero work requirement, yeah?
Yeah. And a very broad range of families. So this is social democratic legislation in the United States, which is not, having written a book on American welfare policy, this is not something I'm familiar with in the United States. So it's a pretty radical departure, dramatic departure from American welfare policy. DeParel in his kind of writing talks about it as really the complete flipping from Bill Clinton's The End of Welfare as We Know It and all the work requirements and the time limits that were brought in the 96 bill, the Work and Reconciliation Act, that really, cut welfare significantly and was one of the sort of end products of the contract with America, promised in the contract with America. And Bill Clinton was told by his pollster, Dick Morris, that if he didn't pass that bill, that was the one thing that Bob Dole could use to beat him. So Bill Clinton signed the bill off. And so a number of people in his administration resigned. A number of his staff in Health and Human Services, longtime friends of Clinton's, even resigned. Peter Edelman. So it's a reversal of that sort of trend with the Democrats. Obama, I suppose, did a lot on health, but didn't probably do dramatically a lot on income beyond some sort of, extension of unemployment during the Great Recession. Biden has also done quite significant things, or the Congress has done significant things with his encouragement on food stamps. So food stamps allowance has really increased. So people who have really been on the margins of their housing being lost, of being sort of destitute, of not being able to feed themselves under the Trump period during COVID particularly, there's a significant, reports are already coming out saying there's a significant turnaround in people's well-being for the most vulnerable and poorest Americans. So I think that is a big story, and it's one that I think Biden deserves a lot of credit for, having the courage to push that forward, because the need is great. The need is not insignificant that you're dealing with here, and he is... I don't want to use Rahm Emanuel's line, but he has used a crisis to pretty good effect.
Yeah. I'll add two more positive things about this particular rebate, which is, unlike most rebates, you get the payments per month rather than at the end of the year, which if you're poor, you need it month by month. And secondly, it's a refundable rebate, which means that even if you don't work, if you do work and don't earn much money, you don't pay tax, you still get the money. Whereas before, the child tax rebates were it was a deduction from your tax. So if you
didn't
pay
tax credit.
Yeah, exactly. If you didn't earn money, you didn't get any extra.
Yep.
So that is a big difference. So do you feel that he hasn't gotten enough credit for this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's there's obviously a lot going on globally. The COVID story is the big story, so it's under the sort of headlines. But it was something that jumped out at me, and it did strike me as, having followed American politics for a long time, taught it since about 1992, that, this is a pretty massive departure for the United States. This isn't the kind of thing the United States does for poor people generally, and certainly not since really the reforms of the 1960s have we seen dramatic increases in cash payments to poorer Americans. That has not been a trend. And so this is where he wants to put himself in the pantheon of FDR and LBJ, and they're those comparisons seem overblown at times, but on this occasion, I think it's justified.